Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Back in rabbinical school, one of the central parts of our education was a semester or a whole session on CPE, Clinical Pastoral Education. Now, this is something that wasn't part of the curriculum until a few years ago. It used to be part of the curriculum, then it stopped, and then it was brought back. So clinical pastoral education is basically chaplaincy work. So when you go to visit someone who's sick or who's in the hospital, who might be at home, or someone who's grieving, all of these different processes of how we're supposed to talk to people. And there's a lot of theory that comes with this, there's a lot of theology that comes with it, and there's a lot of practice that comes with it. So all of us got placed in different places. I was actually doing hospice in Borough Park in Brooklyn. But our classes were probably the most interesting part of our clinical pastoral education, because even though it was taking place in the Jewish Theological Seminary, all of the people who were participating weren't necessarily Jewish clergy, but clergy from Christianity, from Islam, from Judaism as well. So we kind of had a hodgepodge of different religions coming together to learn and to talk. And we noticed very, very quickly that whenever we talked about the theory and the theology of what we were doing with chaplaincy work, with clinical pastoral education, the Jewish clergy were on it. Very quickly, we were talking about our sources from the Talmud, our sources from the Torah, talking about what it means to visit the sick, to visit people in the hospital, to visit a house of Shiva, all of these different things. And we felt pretty good about it. It's not a competition, but if clinical pastoral education was a competition, the Jews were really killing it at this point. We were doing great. We were doing really, really well. Until we got to the session on prayer. And when we got to the session on prayer, we thought, we do prayer really well in Judaism. We know what we're doing. We go to Shabbat morning. We have 3 hours of prayer service. We have different prayer services throughout the week. We know our Hebrew like the back of our hand. We know what we're doing. But when we realized that a lot of our patients weren't Jewish and didn't care if we could recite Shaarey or Kaddish, and they wanted a prayer from the heart, extemporaneous prayer, we were terrible. Terrible. And we went around in our classes to try to work on what prayer would look like, and our Protestant and Catholic brothers and sisters would stand up and they would give extemporaneous prayer where they would close their eyes and they would speak from the heart, and we were in awe. And then invariably they would call one of us to try, and it was the most awkward thing you have ever seen in your life. Where we would start by saying, Dear Hashem, hey God. And we really quickly realized that although we are very, very good at talking about God, we as Jews are not so good at talking to God. At least from outside of the Mabea, at least from outside of the structure of the liturgy that we have in front of us. We realized this really, really quickly, and then we realized that is something that's pretty important. Because you're right, we can do all of these things. We can do Shaarey, and we can do Kaddish, and we can do these things really, really well. But when it comes to the time when we're really in a place of emotion, of joy, of sadness, of grief, of anger, we're not so good at talking to God. We have some issues there. And we looked at this just as our Jewish clergy to kind of figure out why this is, because that's not our tradition. We see all over the place in our tradition, in rabbinic text, all of these rabbis who fervently pray to God in a way that we could really model ourselves after, and we study all of these texts, and why aren't we doing it the way that they do? And then we go into the Torah, we see a different idea of prayer. It wasn't too long ago, just a few weeks ago, when we were at Yetziat Mitzrayim, when we were passing through the Red Sea, and we had Miriam gather up all of the Israelite women and sing fervently a prayer to God that was true emotion and true joy, singing, Mi chamocha ba'elim et Adonai. Who is like you, God? It's joy. That's speaking to God in a way that is from the heart. We see other examples in the Torah when Miriam is inflicted with the skin disease that takes up over her arm, and Moshe prays fervently for her healing. Fervently, from his heart. And probably the most famous example in the Tanakh is Hannah, who is told that she can never have children. And she so badly wants to have a child. She prays fervently to have a child. She goes and offers her sacrifice and is in the area of the temple praying so fervently that one of the priests, Eli, thinks she's drunk. Because she's praying with so much ecstasy. She doesn't need a prayer book. She's praying from her heart. We've kind of lost that somewhere along the way. And we have a really, really interesting fourth example in our parasha this week. So I made a mistake. Before we were going to do the Torah reading, I was going to give you a little bit of a challenge to see if you noticed anything interesting in the Torah reading this week. Something that was missing or something that would stand out. But because I messed up and didn't give you the opportunity, let me tell you that this is the one parasha after Moses' birth, with the exception of the book of Deuteronomy because it goes into the first person, where Moses' name isn't mentioned once. It's not mentioned at all. So the early commentators try to figure out exactly why that is. And we remember that this is immediately after the Egel HaZahav, the golden calf. And what does Moses do when he comes down and he sees the golden calf? God says, look at these people. I can't believe them. I'm going to crush them. We're going to start all over again. And Moses says, no, you can't. I know that I am just your servant, but I'm not going to let you do this. These people make mistakes, just like you and I make mistakes. We have to forgive them and we have to move on. So the early commentators, see this as so chutzpahdik that he has a whole parasha where he's not mentioned to punish him. But, and this is when it gets really good, the later commentators, including this great commentator known as the Baal HaTurim, says, no, dafka the opposite. When Moshe has this chutzpah to engage in one-on-one dialogue with God and to pray fervently to God in anger and frustration that God would even think about wiping out God's children, God respects Moses for standing up and saying something. And instead of omitting his name for this entire parasha, the Baal HaTurim looks at it a little bit differently and says, Moses' name isn't mentioned because God speaks directly to Moses this entire time and says, you, in a way that is so informal and intimate that Moses is actually rewarded for how he stands up to God. We have all of these examples of prayer. These examples of prayer that are straight from the heart, that might not actually sit with what we have as an idea of what prayer should look like. In Judaism, we're not so much about making requests. We don't have that kind of milieu, that idea that we get from the milieu that we were brought up in with, kind of kneeling by our bedside with our hands together, asking for things. That's not really how Jews pray. But what we do, or at least what we used to do, is when our heart was ready to burst with whatever feelings we had, whether they be joy, whether they be sadness, whether they be grief or frustration and anger, it was our duty, it was our obligation to get rid of our names and to go one-on-one with God and say, you. I'm turning to you. I need you. Because I'm so ecstatic that I want to celebrate with you. Because I'm so sad that I need you to comfort me. That I'm so scared and angry with you that I really need to give you a piece of my mind. Whatever it might be, our model is one where we get off of the matbeh, where we get off of the set liturgy when we need to, and when we speak directly from our heart to God. And this is hard for us. We're people of the book. We like having text. And the text is beautiful, and the text is important, and we need it because it sets up a structure for us. But it's important to remember that the text is meant to be there as our guide, not as a place for us to hide. We're not supposed to hide ourselves and our emotions and how we're really feeling by only speaking the liturgy. You'll see if you read through the prayer book, if you read through the Siddur, there are different passages that we have included in the conservative movement to say, Dafka, you need to pause right now, and you need to pray from your heart. You have been following the liturgy, you have been following everything we've been doing up until this point. but right now it's between you and God. And so I'm going to invite us to do that moment of being a little uncomfortable and a little awkward, and we might start our prayer by saying, Dear Hashem, or something weird that doesn't make us feel good and it feels a little uncomfortable. But what I'm going to do is immediately after this, when we go into the Musaf Amidah, we're going to go silently into prayer one-on-one before God. And for many of us, we are going to go through the whole Hebrew or the whole English because that's what we're used to doing. But I want you to pay attention because at the end there is a little paragraph that says, pause here for personal thought, personal prayer, and reflection. And I want to challenge you all and challenge myself too, to use that time and to use that moment, regardless of how silly it feels, regardless of how very not Jewish it might feel, and to just close your eyes and to have a moment with God, and to go away from that language of names, of Hashem, of Adonai, of Elohim, and to say, you, and to allow God to say you right back. So my bracha, so my blessing for us this Shabbat, is to allow ourselves to feel a little silly, to allow ourselves to feel a little uncomfortable, a little anxious, a little nervous, but know that you are surrounded by a community who is not judging anyone, who wants us all to experience prayer in the best possible way we can because it helps us grow and it helps us become better as Jews and as people, and to be able to celebrate Shabbat in the way that we're meant to celebrate Shabbat, which is not just as a community and not just as a family, but with God as well. Shabbat Shalom.